Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, so you can't predict any of that, right? And
Probably not,
what so
no.
what are your thoughts about like this idea of against making life plans? If you want to describe the whole that what I just said as if you want to sum it up, the conclusion, the generalization is loosely against making life plans.
I mean, you still have a trajectory. I just think you're still working on things. I think the point of like productivity is less about the exact line you go on and more about that following a line is what provides opportunities, or following a direction provides opportunities, that following a purpose brings you to opportunities.
Mhm.
Even if there's like no planning for those things you find, it's not like nothing went into it. I mean, they're still working on your health, your well-being, your psychology, your ways of thinking. Even when you're doing that job, how do you build on it? How do you get to something else from there? I mean, clearly you're going to have many options to go from. It's not so much the specific plans as
Yeah.
your adaptability to plans.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the more important things about having a purpose in life, as far as a general way of approaching your goals, your objectives, or general things. And that's why you don't always want to plan so far ahead that you're making assumptions of what you should be able to acquire, which you always can't always do. You can have a general idea of what is my nature, what is required to do that, to what degree can I be concrete about my abilities and skills, and to what extent do I leave things open to uncertainty. You have to have a balance, I think, because there's no way, of course, to absolutely know what to do. But what we can do is identify what we need to live according to our nature and what's unique to us as individuals. As individuals,
Yeah.
and that's what you can do.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think defining a mission is possible or easy for a lot of people early on to put
Right.
something, like you're describing balancing. Well, I mean, I guess you're describing a generalized goal such that things can change, but you still head in some direction. A lot of it's hard to
Right.
do that without lots of concretes first, I think. Or for most people, there are definitely exceptions,
Right.
like people who love piano right from uh, age 3, and they're like, I want to be in music. So it's not like music is going to disappear, but
Right.
for most people, I don't know. And then
Yeah.
yeah, I liked it. But it's not. It doesn't. It's just a very short little thing, but it definitely captures
Yeah. But
something.
I get the idea of the randomness almost itself being appealing, and that you could cut yourself off from opportunities if you have a very specific, rigid plan. That could
Right,
be problematic.
right,
Those
right,
rigid
right.
plans, but and I don't think I think if we think in principles, it should be flexible. You
Mm,
can't be rigid about these things because principles are like starting points,
hmm.
and you apply your principles to the situation. It's not, they're not rules, they're
Yes,
ways to think
they're
and unique to our
generalizations.
application. Yeah, so
Yeah,
they should only apply to general statements, but sometimes we could use them to determine specifics. But as you said, you need more concretes to do that.
yep,
You might not be able to. You might really need just more examples in life. And that's just the way it goes. You can't just wish you had the examples, because that's how you know anything, with
yeah.
examples, with concretes in the world.
I think there was. I can't remember if it was in one of Leonard Peikoff's lectures, but in relation to principles, I did hear someone speaking about. Imagine if you'd set yourself the goal of I only want to get married to um, I don't know how to say it in feet, but let's say 1.75 meter blonde with blue eyes who is a PhD in chemistry. You're
Right.
completely narrowing in a way that's not helpful at all. Let's
Right.
say narrowing the pool. I think he gave some examples like that, as opposed to someone who is, more abstract, a description of more abstract
Right.
qualities, which then includes a lot more concrete. Yeah, I can't remember where that was, but I think it totally touches on what we're talking about. And what do you think of this thing at the top? Most people make New Year's resolutions, so that is goals, and then very few make solutions, which means, like, I think what it's getting at, which I liked, is that you can set goals, but if you don't work back from the goal and develop actions and solution, like backward, engineer backwards from the goals to the like specific actions you take, then it's useless.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, really seeing it this way, removing impediments, this is like a way of rephrasing what a goal is or what a goal should be. I mean, I think this is a better way to look at it than just what do I want, but rather the process to get there. You must identify a goal, but the process sometimes is just as important. You can't have a goal without the process. It's not
Yeah,
just the goal or the
yeah,
willpower, but how do you identify the sub steps in between? That's really what counts. I mean,
right,
obviously, in the same sense, like you want to live and living is important, but that in itself doesn't tell you much. You got to make abstractions, you got to make identifications, you got
right.
to see what's in between. What other facts do you need to know to be able to do that? Or even the same way as morality, like your goals, so make identifications about it. What are barriers to it? What are necessary things? What aspects do you have now? What aspects do you need? And what could take time versus what can you do now? Things like that.
um it makes me think of that quote. Oh, it's actually from John Galt. A desire is not knowledge.
Right. It's not.
Yeah, it was part of a bigger sentence, but I can't remember. I
Yeah.
just remember that part. A desire to live is not the knowledge needed to live, something like that.
Mhm.
And then I guess that kind of speaks to this idea of removing impediments. So, um, like, so the analogy is your life is more like a sculpture than a painting, which you're subtracting away material to get to the final. I've often heard this
Mhm.
in books. It sounds kind of platonic to me, where you're like, you're taking away layers to find the thing that is you. But at the same time, I don't think there's nothing to it, because we definitely have, genetics predisposes us. We have certain tendencies just from childhood and psychology that are difficult to change. So there's something to it, but it's like, this idea of like, eliminate the things you don't like. Like, let's say you're trying to find satisfaction in work. This was one example that's somewhat related to this. Then you're eliminating the things you don't enjoy, and you eventually start getting deeper and deeper into the things that you do, and that would be more of a recipe, rather than a recipe for finding satisfaction, than say creating some overarching goal and figuring out how do I move towards that, which is interesting. I don't What do you think of that, like this idea of, instead of trying to, it's not that you don't need a goal, you need a goal, but it's actually easier to just eliminate things you don't like than to work towards finding some
Yes,
one. Yeah,
I agree. It's easier. And in a way, sometimes that prevents growth because it's easier. I'm thinking about it this way, like you have a notion yourself that you're perfect just the way you are. You just need to get more of what makes you feel good and what makes you less stressed. And stressful things bad, so take them out. But that's very simplistic, or in a way, it is platonic in a way, in the sense that like there's this you-ness that you're satisfying. But
yes,
what really you are is just you can shape change and you're malleable in a sense. What you are now is not you as a person are someone who thinks, someone who has values in the long term, but are you just the things you like? Seems rather inessential. Like, oh, I know jazz music, so I'm gonna play less whatever other kind of music in the office or something. I don't know, or I can't think of examples of things that make you happy. That can you think of an example?
But I'm not quite following. Like you're
Okay.
not. It sounds interesting, but what do you mean by you're not just the things you like? What, and then you just like if you love
Well, we
jazz,
got
it
to
means you
think
eliminate.
about the potential of what we could become, what we could attain, what we could find, not just building on who we are now, but exactly who we're not.
Oh,
Trying to
and
think about what be your
I
kind
get
of
it.
those potentials are part of you as well.
And
We
you're
can't ignore
saying
that.
and you're saying sometimes to cultivate those, it's not enjoyable.
Not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it is enjoyable, and the way how well you maybe integrate it. Sometimes it can be pleasurable. Sometimes it can be stressful. Like if you had, I don't know, maybe the most obvious example, like an easy example would be like you got in an accident, and you gotta put through with all these things that make you unhappy for recovery. And in the end, you're happier than you ever were. Or if, say, you need to go to take a class you hate, but you know it's important, you kind of put up with it. Might not make you happy, but in another sense, it does because it gets you somewhere happy. It gets you somewhere essential to your potential, the potentials you want to actualize. Um,
Yeah, I guess you could add a qualifier and say, don't do anything you hate unless it gets you where you want to go.
yes, that may be a better way to look at it. You don't want to just say that's, oh, let's make the things that put things in my life that put me at ease and make me happy. It's more like, how do you cultivate an environment where you're even doing the things you don't like to attain this actualized potential that you want? You know your potential, and if you take time to do something, you know you could get something, but you have to decide which ones are worth it, which ones that you think are essential to discovering or understanding, and not just working from, oh, I know this makes me happy, so I'll just do that. In a way, we're looking for something you don't even have yet. In life, is a constant process. So in a way, you never have it. You never have it. You're just constantly in the process, constantly developing it. And you can't really be static, like a constant process.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess with all of these, they're simple, but they're not to be taken as just simple. But yes, if you have sometimes in order to actualize a potential, maybe you need to do something that's not satisfying.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I guess we could skip the whole thing of blind to opportunities, but if you've got, I don't know if you want to comment on that, you can.
Let's
It's just
see.
the idea that like you can, like you've got to look at what's actually available in front of you to do and work on rather than some long range option in the future that you want to keep open. Because the best form of learning is trial and error, meaning actually engaging in some work that is available to you rather than, let's say, I want to be this, I want to be, I don't know, uh, I want to be a trader or not a trader,
Yeah.
maybe a doctor. I want to be a doctor. And then you spend like 12 years at school, but you don't really know what being a doctor is yet. So in that case, you'd be like, do I have the option of, say, volunteering at a medical center, or like, do I have the option of engaging in chemical experiments, or I don't know, anything that you could actually do now in the form of trial and error rather than sort of think about a long range
Yeah.
option. That was the idea there.
I mean, I get the idea. I just don't like the explanation that they're using.
Okay.
Like, oh, it's the option versus opportunity. I mean, I don't see the value in that distinction I mean, in a way, it seems like it's saying, don't just go into all the what ifs of those what if opportunities.
Yeah.
Don't multiply them beyond any reasonable necessity. I mean, yeah, we
Yeah.
can think about the future, but sometimes the now is very important because those are the immediate steps. And yes, the future is in a way theoretical because it can only exist abstractly, but the concretes are in front of you. You can't ignore the concretes in front of you now. You
Right.
can't just forego the choices now for the mere potential later. In a way that, so it does make sense in a way.
Yeah.
The now is the actual, the future
Yeah.
is the potential.
Right. The next part is honesty. So I read that, I think from The Art of Thinking, that a principle is an integration of generalization. So when we say, for example, honesty is a principle, so that means it's an integration of a generalization. Are we saying, like, okay, honesty is an integration of existence exists. It's an integration of rationality is holding reason as, your only means of knowledge, guide to action, and that kind of thing. Is that what we mean? Where like all these random generalizations about, I don't know if existence exists as a generalization, but I don't think it is. Or
Let me show you
man,
something.
yeah, okay.
I've got something to show you that I wrote for this question because I know you've noticed you ask a bunch of related questions. So I wrote some things down that might help. Let me change my share screen. I wrote it in Notepad. You see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, just read the first two paragraphs.
Okay. This is well written.
Thanks.
Okay. Um,
I'm not sure how much that helps, but
no, it
I thought it
does.
might.
It makes sense
Okay.
that a principle is it's a, well,
Starting point.
even in OPA, he writes that value is a type of identification. It's a truth because it's a type of identification made according to a standard,
Yeah.
and that standard is either derived from reality or it's not. And so it's judged in relation to the facts. So that's an identification.
Yeah.
But with it being a starting point, you mean when you say that, it's like, could I think of it as guardrails or like you said, sets the context? So for example, it'll delimit what I'm thinking about it simply as delimiting my actions. And I can still take many, many, many actions. For example, if I go for a walk, it doesn't matter if I go for a walk through the park or if I go through a walk through the city, but it will tell me, okay, well, on the walk, I can't just steal from the store and
Yeah.
take some free dark chocolate. I can't steal, for example. In that sense, it like delimits my actions, but I still have a lot of actions. Is that what you mean by starting point?
Yeah. Or in a sense, as soon as you ask, should I do something? It's like the first thing you ask, like, well, what field is this? It's morality. What area of morality? Well, should I take something? Well, or should I lie? It's like, oh, well, I should bring in my principle of honesty, or the subject I talk about when speaking the truth. It's honesty. So, what basic fact do I know about honesty? What basic thing do I run with? You're almost saying that these are the important things to talk about. So this is what I'm going to talk about first. Like, first question, like, what would be honest? Then further application would be like, in what way would this be honest? Would taking this action be honest? Would that action be honest? If I said this instead, would that be honest? Or if you bring in more context, say, you could know that the person's actually like a murderer, should you lie to them? Or then you might say, just further questions from there. That's not the be all end all word to use, but it sets the context of how you ask these questions. I mean, of course, you don't necessarily have that principle before you ever think about morality, but that once we start thinking about a subject like morality, we can then discover principles. Like, what are the founding or starting questions we should ask when discussing morality? And for Rand, these are the kind of questions you would ask based on some basic identifications about the nature of man, what's necessary for him to exist and survive. You can go from there, say, well, given that, it seems we need these basic facts and ideas before we go talking about even more or even further. Because you can't talk about like what's the right thing to say to somebody that you don't like. I mean, do you need to talk to them? I mean, you need some way of addressing those ideas and questions.
And when you say broader and narrower context, is that in levels of abstraction?
Yes.
Okay. And then what's this thing at the end, which I know it's not necessarily related, but it is interesting. Knowledge is a fact to explain, not a puzzle to solve.
There's a line I really liked in the book I'm reading. So I thought it was good to point out. It just sounded insightful and interesting. Related to
Yeah, I
Aristotle.
don't get it. It sounds interesting. I don't, but
Yeah, and you know what people like say? Maybe say like, why do we have knowledge? There's no way that knowledge can be real. How do we really know anything? We have to figure it out. Does it even exist?
Oh,
It's not
okay.
like you say, I know knowledge is real.
Oh,
All
I
I have to
get
do is
it.
say, oh, this is how it's acquired.
I
Rather
get
than
it.
trying to say, is it real? You take it for granted, like, yeah, it's self-evident, kind of.
Yeah,
We know
I
it's a
get it.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are foundations and you have to, like,
Yeah.
they're there. It's just a question of explaining them. Why is it that we can
Yeah.
reason, or why is it that we can,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
why is it that some sentences make sense and are reasonable and some are not, as opposed to,
Yeah.
is there even things that make sense? Like, do they exist or not? How do we, like,
Yeah.
that kind of, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Is
Um,
there really a you? Is there really a you? Or is there only a me?
right.
Like solipsism.
Uh, okay. And then with principles being integrations of generalizations, how do you, am I right in saying it's sort of taking things like man is an attribute, man is a integration of two attributes, mind and body. That's a generalization.
I'd say
And
so.
it's taking man is reason is man's means of survival. That's a generalization. And it's integrating all those to get honesty, right? So in that sense, it's a principle.
In that sense, I would say so.
Okay.
It's a principle for moral thinking, but
Yep.
it's based on reasoning from other areas, like the nature of man, his needs in life, and things like that.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, that's all I had for that.
Okay. That was good.
Okay, questions? Okay.
Um, maybe we can go through some of if you go up to, let me see. Maybe do you want to switch it up and go to mental models for a bit? We can come back to this.
Sure.
So these are some that I wrote down, and I was curious to discuss some of them with you because this book that I read, which it is really like just an encyclopedia of all these concepts. I don't
Yep.
like the word mental models, but I do wonder if they're actually useful, of this is just someone just combining tons and tons of random concepts from different fields, because I couldn't always find application to thinking. So for example, unforced error is the first one,
Yeah.
or inverse thinking. Have you heard of inverse thinking?
What is it?
Inverse thinking is, if you, as an example, let's say you think about you want to attain something, like you want to attain some goal. I want to make X amount of dollars by the end of the year. And then what you do is you think about, if I wanted to not make that amount of money, if I wanted to like do really badly this year, what would have to happen for me to do really badly? And then you think about, all right, well, I'd need to, I'd need to basically be spending a lot of my time not focusing on work. So that's one thing. I'd need to not be reaching out to people and asking for help and asking them questions. So that's another. And then, so what that makes you do is try to eliminate those things that would prevent you from getting to your goal in the first place, as opposed to necessarily figure out exactly what gets you there, eliminating those things that will definitely prevent you from getting to that goal. That's one example of inverse thinking. I think you may have actually started with that a while ago. You gave me an example of inverse thinking. Do you remember?
Yeah, it's like, if you don't know if something is true, think about what would make it true. What would need to be true for it to become true. Like a counterfactual.
Right. In this case, it was the example I read was the opposite. So if you want something to be true, what do you need for it not to be true? That kind of thing. Yeah.
That too.
Yeah, I guess that might be useful in philosophy. I haven't found, even though trying to think through things, I haven't found it too useful. But
Yeah,
that seems
these seem like they could be combined generally. Some of them
right.
could be useful on their own. Like
Right.
thinking in opposite terms can be useful. It's like the devil's advocate, thinking in terms that you don't normally. And you could break that down further and just say, you normally want to do good. Well, if you want to do bad, what would that require?
Right.
Just thinking about it in a different context or
To help.
resetting your goals.
Yes. I'm going to run to the bathroom. I'm busting to go.
Sure.
So just, I'll be back in a second.
Sure.
All right. So the next, you've probably looked through. I mean, we don't need to go through all of them. The
Yeah.
point is, I'm just trying to, because the book is massive. It's got like 300 of these. I'm just trying to figure out how useful they are in integrating them. And like,
I'll see what I think are useful. Well, arguing for first principles, I think that's good. I mean, just what we're saying,
although
the starting points.
right, that's what we were talking about before. But then
It-
it's not always obvious what the first principles are in
Yes,
any specific thing
it
you're
isn't.
thinking about, right?
It's not, but I think it's a necessary starting point though. You start talking about it. You start figuring out what are the basic things we are discussing. Even just what is it that we're talking about? And it could be, yeah, check your premises. What are those things? Everything else is
Although
relying upon.
we're relying on higher level abstractions then, because like,
Yes.
it's not like Aristotle learned reasoning by starting
Yeah.
from the principles of reasoning, right?
Yeah. Well, and just even everyday language sometimes. Like if you want to talk about a subject, just some of the intuitive, common sense starting points are usually enough. You don't need to get into fancy language. Like if you're talking about, say, painting, if you want to talk about how to paint, you might start with just brush strokes or types of paint you use. Nothing really complicated, just these basic things you start with. And those could be, in a sense, first principles. If you talk about any subject, start with the more simple things first.
Question
Even
for you
whatever,
then. Yeah, sorry, go on.
de-risking, it's just a weird way to phrase that.
Before
Test
we
your
go on
assumptions,
though,
of course.
let me ask you about first principles, something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, as an example, let's say you want to organize an event and you know nothing about events. You haven't run events before. And
Yeah.
so to think about events from first principles, in a sense, you're borrowing, like you're hoping that the person you're learning from or the course or the book has principles that are based, like has generalizations that are based on a legitimate set of observations made, and the generalizations are made well because you don't have the concretes, right? So is that what is meant? Like you just start even if you don't have knowledge of the subject, you start from some abstraction, and then obviously you check that it works when you test it, but in a sense you begin floating. Is that?
That's not what I mean anyway. I
Oh,
just
okay.
mean like those first principles should be relatively easy to see what they are in a concrete way. And it isn't at the level that the person has reached abstractly. I mean, they could identify it later and know which concretes to point out to you. But once they point it out to you, it should be just as easy to see as it is for them. It should be concrete. It should be clear. If it's not clear what the starting point is, then they're not teaching you well enough. That's what I would say. They
Yeah,
should be able to give you something.
I'm just pointing out, like, even in, if we go from moral principles, like, they're not that, like, even in, say, honesty or independence, they're not that concrete. Like, they're still it. So moral principles are very abstract. So that's an example of, like, in some sense, they're floating for me. And so if you argue from first principles, what would that mean for me if the moral principles, let's say I want to argue about a certain action, and for me some moral principles are floating, then what would it mean to argue from first principles in that context?
To have the concrete or the near concrete thing, the easy to identify might be a principle that's easy to find concretely. Like if whatever the principle is, you should be able to find the example easily. And I think only then could you argue from first principles. Otherwise, you're
Okay.
just a student, as far as I
Yeah.
put it. But
Okay.
it shouldn't be hard. Whatever you're using as a principle should be easy to at least point at. Like you should be able to point at what honesty is, even if you have a lot of questions. It's fine at the questions, but you still know what it is. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
not a confusing thing to
Yeah.
say that's a question of honesty. It's just the application you don't know about. But you could at least
Right.
start at the beginning. It's like, oh,
Right.
this is honesty. And admit you don't know the rest, but you know what it is at least.
One
Um,
thing, I was thinking about with these is, I can see how, what you said earlier is that they kind of um, help you consciously shift your perspective. Or you said something like that. I can't remember the exact words, but I can see how this might be useful if you know which ones to use in which contexts, and then that way you train your, like, you help yourself you consciously direct yourself to focus on the
yeah,
relative factors, the relevant factors, I mean. Whereas if you're, when it's like this, it's almost like you don't know what is, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
if you could, in each context, like in a decision making context, you're like, all right, here are the concepts or mental models that are helpful, and then you record them and you applied them. That would be one thing. But if it's just like, it's not always clear, like in what context, like unforced error, right? Like, I can see how in a
yeah,
competitive game that might be a perspective to take in terms of getting good at that competitive game, but outside that context, I don't really see it.
yeah.
Or
I agree.
anti-fragile.
Yes, I feel like I use all these, but always in very different fields. Like if unforced error is never something that goes with MVP for me. Like I use both, but neither of them are together. So I don't integrate by just, oh, what's inverse thinking? I usually integrate by certain fields. I know like in science matters a lot for Occam's razor, but not much about business reasoning in my experience. So like I remember it in terms of the things in science, I kind of organize in one way in my head.
And what do you think about anti-fragile? Because that was originally from a financial markets context for, like, products that, like putting on positions that can benefit from volatility and, world chaos and this kind of thing. But then it has been stretched to be like, you know benefiting from unfavorable circumstances, which to me is like, well, if it's unfavorable, then you're not you know what I'm saying? It's kind of inbuilt
Yeah,
contradiction in the thing. And I couldn't, if you try and apply it outside, it's going to be like, well, how do I benefit from this difficult experience? But that's not, I don't see that as necessarily being I couldn't see it as being helpful. Like, okay, well, if I have a bad time, it makes sense that I reflect and try grow from it. But to then say, oh, I applied the mental model of being anti-fragile, to me is bizarre.
Yeah, I don't agree with it. I mean, I get the idea of put up with bad situations. Sometimes those can motivate you to really get out of the situation, and in that sense, they can be motivating. But I don't think they themselves. It can be tricky. I don't see a normal context where I'd use it.
The
Not in
concept
science
is,
anyway.
so it's trying to differentiate. There's a thing that's robust that can survive in a lot of different conditions. And then it's trying to get at that there's a thing that can thrive in very difficult and unfavorable circumstances. It's not like that you necessarily want to put yourself in those, but it's a question of like, can you make yourself become anti-fragile? But I never found anything from that I could,
I could just think of like ER doctors, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that applies.
Okay.
A lot of these I just feel like are so contextual. Like framing, nudging, anchoring are good for certain things of like communication, I think, but not much outside that context.
Right.
I integrate these things only in terms of area of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, they've partially done that, but it's still,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't like their
still,
method.
so it's very broad.
Yeah, I don't like the method. I mean, the ideas here look fine.
Yeah.
They're distinct enough. I would just
Yeah.
reorganize it. I don't like the organization at all.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the librarian
So,
in me.
or
That's my
organizing
job
it,
practically.
organizing it by applicable context. But a lot of the time, the context, like if you go up to filter bubble, I think it's filter.
Yeah.
It's a bit further up.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Filter bubble. That was, so the guy who wrote it is the one who started DuckDuckGo, right? So he's talking about how search engines customize some search engines, obviously Google, customize the search results according to your cookies and previous interests. And so in a sense, it's like, it's filtering according to things you're already interested in.
Yeah.
And then he used that, I don't know, he gave a more of a description, but he used that as an example of like, I think let's see if I can find it. I don't know if I can find the explanation, but it related to echo chamber, where you're in an environment where you keep reinforcing what you know, but you don't learn new things.
Yeah. They're the same.
But I couldn't see that outside of the context of just a search engine. So I think you're right in that, because these are concepts, they're contextual, but then it's a question of like, I don't even know where some of them are applicable. So like,
it doesn't even seem useful. I mean,
sorry?
I could almost come up with it immediately, and that's just recognize that other people can make you biased. I mean, that's the only thing I need for that. I mean, I guess there is just one of those things you just remember quickly. I mean, there are basic facts of reasoning you just do quite easily. Some of it's practice, but filter bubble, echo chamber, it's really just a version of check your assumptions or double check your premises. Some versions of that, I think, because you're just basically asking, am I actually thinking independently, or is it just taking conclusions of someone else? I think it's a form of that.
Yeah, I think so too. I guess there's a lot in here, so maybe there's a few that are useful.
I would just grab the
this
ones
is not
that
even
are,
the whole list. This is like, I'm like 30% into this book.
Yeah.
With arguing from first principles, isn't it like, how does it work if it's not deductive? Like, to me, it always sounds deductive to argue from first principles. Like, you have to be honest. Honest means not faking reality. Therefore, you shouldn't be building an airplane because airplanes don't exist in reality. So I know we don't mean that, but it seems like if you say argue from first principles, it's almost deductive. You're trying to deduce from a big generalization. But then what would you counter to that?
I would come up with Um, I'm trying to use them as ways to ask better questions in a way. If I know honesty is this, what kind of question would I ask about this situation? If phrasing it that way, like what kind of question could I ask? Not what would I decide at this second, or rather
Okay.
what I
Okay.
ask. That would
Okay.
then bring me to another question,
Okay.
maybe another conclusion. Go from
All
there
right.
rather than just conclusion to conclusion. That's one way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. With the tragedy of the commons, which is an economic concept,
Yep.
that applies to, so that actually does, it's an economic concept, but it does seem to apply to
Yes.
lots of situations. Like
That's a good one.
if you share
That one
house, for
especially.
example, which is quite
Yep.
common now for people to share houses because it's expensive to rent and all that. And then that definitely comes up. Like as an example, if you buy a nice frying pan, no one, like everyone else will scrape it and scratch it, and because they don't care, it's not theirs. And then if if like, this can also happen if someone people don't refill the kettle, then when you go to boil water and the kettle's empty, you won't fill it up to the top because you just want it to fill quick. You just want it to, you just want it to heat quickly, and no one else is going to refill it, and you're
Yeah.
pissed off. And then you see how the whole thing just degenerates into like
Yes.
nothing functions well. And so that
Yep.
seems to apply to a lot of different contexts. But would you agree that it's a concept from economics, not a mental model, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, I prefer to think of it as a yeah, a phenomena within economics.
Right.
It's
And
always
then
very, yeah, I would say so.
it's just an issue of, okay, um, in what context is this, like being able to identify in certain contexts from my entire knowledge base what concepts are applicable. So like economic concepts might be applicable to some day-to-day
Yeah.
situations. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of that's creativity, trying out these concepts you maybe didn't think of applying, but you could apply because it's in your knowledge base.
Right.
Just try them out sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So I will keep going through this, but I guess the the um, the important point is to try and identify the context to where it's applicable.
That's what I would say. And really just focus on the ones you find useful. Because some of these are, they're not bad, but they seem so not essential that you could forget it and not have a problem ever. And
Yeah.
you might just be able to come up with it in the context anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It always usually comes down to checking your assumptions and arguing from principles, I think. I mean, those are the most fundamental things. Or beginning from first principles or checking assumptions.
Which is
Those are
checking your
usually,
primaries, right? Check your
yeah,
primaries.
principles, primaries, premises.
Yeah.
And from there, you can usually accomplish most of these.
What are your thoughts on Pareto Principle? Because that's often, I've heard that's used to death in like business context, which is annoying because I don't know. It came from some economist who found
Yeah.
that 80% of peas harvested in the garden came from only 20% of pods. And now there's entire books, or like there's entire books written on like find the 20 that creates the 80 results. Like, and then you're like, you do 80-20 analysis for your entire life and all that. But like it, this is, not everything is distributed 80-20. Like if I write a book, I don't know if it's useful necessarily for me to think about what is the 20% I can do that will lead to 80% of the results. Maybe, but what are your thoughts on that? Because that's definitely one that's used a lot.
I don't feel I could use it for much other than to recognize that often the most effort comes from the fewest. It's not that useful, I find. I mean, it doesn't,
Okay.
I never found it useful. I
Yeah. Okay.
guess maybe in business management, it could work to get an
Well,
idea
maybe,
beforehand,
but it
but I
might
don't
not,
know.
right? Like without
Might
knowing the
not.
context, you might be wasting, you
No.
might be it might be like a pointless exercise to try find the 20. Maybe there's a lot of
Yeah.
little things and not just 20 that creates 80.
Yes, I don't think it's worth it.
Okay. Do you want to fit in one more question from the other thing?
Did we have another?
Yeah, so there's all links above, but let's see if there's one. What? So scroll down. Actually, yeah, let's do this one. It kind of suits because it's relevant. So principles making observations intelligible. That's one of the benefits of principles according to the AOT, art of thinking. And so I get that they bring generalizations in relation to one another. And so, like man is a integration of two attributes, mind and body. Existence exists. Like suddenly there's a relationship between them that leads to honesty, for example. So it brings things in relation to one another. I get that. But then what does it mean so he said this in the lecture, there are basic facts, which is where you see that dot point where there's some red in there.
Yeah.
There are basic facts, starting points you can't explain. For example, A is A and the ultimate laws of physics. And all understanding is observing data and taking it back a step at a time until ultimately reducing it back to metaphysical primaries. I did not get that. Like, if you observe something, what is there to reduce? Each step back is an increase in understanding because you are tying what you learn to a greater range of data. Principles are our only means to understand the data of reality once we have concepts. I didn't get that. It's close to verbatim copied from his lecture.
I mean, understanding in the broad sense of not just the concretes, but of multiple concretes. I think that's what it's trying to say. That to take your understanding beyond just these immediate concrete things, beyond the this, beyond the pointing, you have to take a step back abstractly, like two particulars can make a concept,
Okay.
or like two dogs make an animal. You can trace it backwards in different ways.
Would I be right to say everything is an effect of existence?
I don't like to say effect. I would say is explained by or caused by. Explain might be a better word. So I'm not trying to say cause like a machine, but just like things are the way they are because of reality, because of existence. There's no other reason besides existence.
So that's like the broadest fundamental. Everything is explained by. Okay, cool. That's what we were getting at before when I was confused by the one fundamental. Maybe we can. So I'll write this down, but I want to mention it too because I've been thinking about it before I forget. One thing I've seen in the coverage of Israel and Gaza, and it's made me think a lot, is when you watch the media and they say, "Oh, that it's the governments are doing this, the normal people, they just want to sell paper, they just want to live their lives." And it made me think, like, it seems like that's always a common thing where that you just say, "Oh, it's just the governments, all the people are normal, they just want to live their lives and get along in peace." But the default is always dictatorship. So it's so weird that we always say that. I'm trying to get at, like, what's going on. I don't get that. It's just maybe our default is dictatorship, because you could say that about any single dictatorship where, the people just want to live their lives, it's not their fault. But then it does seem like it must partially be our fault if our governments are doing crazy things. It can't just be, it's just these foreign governments that are taking over. And but I don't know is there a name for that kind of what I'm trying to get at, the concept?
A name for it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you know what I'm
but
talking about though?
I don't know what to call it though.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, Rand talks about sometimes. She talked about that kind of thing.
Because it's
Like,
not
you can't
enough for me to
just
want peace or want,
yes.
there's something else going on there. I don't get it. But anyway, we can save that for the next.
Yeah, I don't know a particular concept, but I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll see you in. It's fine to shift the. We're fine to shift the.
Okay.